Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Dublin City University event, which is hosted by the DCU Brexit Institute and DELI, the Dublin European Law Institute. My name is Niall Moran. I'm an assistant professor in economic law at DCU and deputy director of the Brexit Institute. It is my great pleasure to introduce this event on trade, tariffs and transatlantic relations after the US elections at this incredibly timely moment. In giving these welcome remarks, I'm replacing my colleague and friend, Professor Federico Fabrini, who is currently at a ceremony in DCU where he is receiving the President's Research Impact Award. This is a prize given that recognises the contribution of researchers to society through their scientific research, and Professor Fabrini is the first legal scholar to receive this award. So I want to congratulate Professor Fabrini on this award, which he truly deserves. Our event today is organised within the framework of my Jean Monnet module on levelling the playing field in EU trade and competition law, although I'm not sure President Trump would agree with my early conclusions on the level playing field in the transatlantic context. For the past few years, the focus of DELI and the Brexit Institute has predominantly been on European and transnational legal studies. We have run a series of large projects, including leading the Jean Monnet Network Prosper, which brings together 12 academic institutions from across the EU. The Centre focuses on bolstering stability, growth and economic resilience across the EU. So this event fits nicely within the scope of our projects, and I can say we will be doing a lot more on trade and economic security in the near future. Before we begin, I just want to say that we are recording this event. It is truly a pleasure to have with us today such a stellar cast of speakers and experts on this subject. We are also in the very capable hands of our moderator, Sarah Collins. Sarah is Brussels correspondent for the Business Post and my go-to source for reporting on economic affairs. So I'll stop here and hand the floor over to Sarah.
Thanks, Niall, and hi, everybody, and welcome. I think the only thing that can be said at this point is what a week. We've got a full-blown trade war that suddenly went on pause. Trump causing problems only to announce he solved them, markets rallying and then down again weirdly this morning. And to kind of, it was just to illustrate this, I took a flight early this morning. I knocked out a really quick story before I left Brussels. I touched down in Warsaw and the story was wrong. By the time I touched down, I had to completely rewrite it because the EU in the interim had announced it was putting its tariffs on pause. So it just is breakneck speed. So we've got a really impressive keynote to try to make sense of it all, an expert panel as well. And I'd like to just a couple of housekeeping notes before I introduce our keynote speaker. Don't forget to send your questions in the chat. Speakers, don't forget to mute yourselves when you're not speaking. And there will be time for questions, maybe in the middle and again at the end. So get them ready, put them in the chat. I'll try to get to as many of them as I can. So with us today as our keynote speaker, we've got Cecilia Malmström, a two-time European Commissioner, first for Home Affairs, then for Trade, which I think is why she's here now. When she was Trade Commissioner, saw in the first Trump presidency in a series of tariff wars that he started then. It's much bigger this time, I think. Cecilia is also a former MEP. She was Sweden's EU Affairs Minister for 4 years, and she's now at the Peterson Institute for International Economics as a non-resident senior fellow. She's also got a PhD in political science, so don't be shy to pump her for all of her expertise. Cecilia, the floor is yours to talk about trade, tariffs, and transatlantic relations.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. Good evening, everybody from Washington. Well, what a week. It is hard to make sense of all of this, but let's try together with the excellent co-panelists as well. It's been quite chaotic and turbulent lately. Tariffs are on, they're off, they're on again, but then there are exceptions and then they are paused, but the other ones still remain. It's not really easy to navigate in that landscape. But what has been clear lately is that the transatlantic relationship and the world order as we used to know it in Europe is severely broken. Trump and Putin are singing from the same hymn sheet when it comes to Ukraine. And there is a very open contempt for the European Union within the Trump administration. And that is so sad. Transatlantic relations used to be so strong. After the Second World War, Europe and the US collaborated very closely together to build up the post-World War II order. setting institutions together that will link us together and avoid future wars. We had NATO, we had United Nations, we had the World Bank, the Bretton Woods organizations, the IMF, GATT, that lately became WTO. We had the Marshall Plan that helped restructuring Western Europe again. And this was made in collaboration and in the firm belief that cooperation was a good thing for both of us across the Atlantic. And we built a very clear friendship and partnership. When the Berlin Wall fell and Europe was united, this was also a time with very strong international institutions, democracy swept all over the world. There was optimism. Maybe that was the peak of globalization. It was a search of quick, efficient supply chains, linking business networks all over the world in a new way, facilitated by the digital transformation and followed by a big wave of trade liberalization and increased market access globally. That was then. That is no longer the case. We have had talks about just with friends, just when it was just in time, that time, then it became just with friends, and now it's maybe just in case. We've seen decoupling, de-risking, friendshoring, deglobalization, terms that popped up lately, and that illustrates that something is really wrong with the globalization. We have witnessed growing protectionism. We saw the brutal invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and the US is withdrawing from multilateralism, from the international system, and from its so strong soft power. And these are challenges that Europe needs to confront. So how did we get there? Well, a few points, and then we can elaborate on them later in the discussions. First of all, during Trump 1, he already said that tariff was a very beautiful word, and he linked trade with national security. That's why he put tariffs on China and on the rest of the world, because that was a national security. A strange way for us to deal with trade, but that's the case. He withdrew from CPTPP and he put tariffs on steel and aluminium in the name of national security. And the new administration has continued this, as you have seen, even more transactional, see no value in trade liberalization as done mutually. And now everything is on the table. Migration, deportation, drug controls, tech rules, Greenland, VAT, etc. We'll come back to this. Trade has also become even more geopoliticized. We saw that with the dependence in Germany and other countries from Russian gas and how that was instrumentalized by the Russian regime. We see how Europe and many other countries are very dependent on China when it comes to rare earth and minerals. In some areas, they control or process or own 85% of some of these minerals that are key to the digital transformation and the green transition. And that has, of course, made us very vulnerable and dependent. And it's in this light, you have to see the statements on Greenland. We have seen a massive race, thirdly, across the world in subsidies and industrial policies. And this is not necessarily a bad thing with subsidies, but it creates tensions within the EU, between the EU and the rest of the world. And it also risks leaving the developing countries aside. The WTO, and supported by calculations in IMF and World Bank, has said that this could actually decrease the global GDP with 5% if the global South are not able to trade on the same conditions as the rest of us. We have green transition entering the trade area, which is a very good thing. Europe is trying to achieve zero emission, and we have other Paris commitments. But it also creates tension. Europe is now trying to roll out the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanisms, which is a good thing, but it does create a lot of tension with other partners. We have 73 different versions of pricing carbon in the world, and there is no way to measure the same way. There is no way to calculate a methodology that everybody can agree upon, and there is no way to supervise this. So, of course, there's a huge need of some sort of international cooperation in this area. And we also see by the Trump administration that the CBAM is creating a lot of tensions as well. And finally, with all these challenges, you would say that the world is in greater need than ever to have strong international organizations where we could cooperate and monitoring. But alas, international organizations are very weak. WTO has huge problems, even G20, G7. And when did you last hear about the United Nations? This is a very sad situation. And this is something where Europe has to navigate. And we have seen that the transatlantic relationship, that has been one of the most important relationships in the world. We trade for $3.7 billion every year, and more than 16 million jobs across the pond are depending on transatlantic trade. We tried to negotiate a free trade agreement many years ago, the so-called TTIP. That failed, unfortunately, but it could have been handy to have it. So what shall Europe do? Well, first of all, respond. As you saw yesterday, the European Commission went out to say that we will put tariffs on the US at a value of 20 billion euros in order to retaliate for the tariffs on steel and aluminium that were put a few weeks ago. 25% of the whole world. And then it said we are also ready to retaliate for the tariffs on cars and aluminium, and then the reciprocal tariffs that Europe got on 20%. Now, of course, things move very quickly in this world. So this morning, the Commission came out and said, okay, the tariffs are paused. We will also pause for 90 days to see if we can get a trade agreement. But they're still there. It's a threat. It is also very tangible. It's been negotiated by member states. The list was approved yesterday, and it is there, and it can be taken out. There are also other weapons in the artillery of the European Union, such as the anti-coercion instrument, which is sometimes called the big bazooka. But I think it's being kept in the closet for the moment, which is a wise thing. The Commission has also announced, and all the member states have repeated it, that we are ready to sit and talk and make a deal. The problem is, of course, what do you make a deal on? Because in the reciprocal tariffs, there was a very strange methodology, but Trump administration has voiced a lot of concerns. It's not only tariffs, it's also the rules in the European Union, the standards, it is the VAT, it is a lot of things that is hard to negotiate in a trade agreement. So let's see, the possibility to buy more gas has been on the table. That can be done, but of course not the amount that the Trump administration has aired. There's a possibility to do things cooperation on China. The Commission has offered a 0 for 0 agreement on goods. That could easily be done, but that would be a limited part of the agreement. But so far, even if Maros Sefcovic, the EU Trade Commission, has been twice in Washington, there has been no opening for a real negotiation. But of course, it should be there. The third thing the EU should do is to continue to conclude trade agreements. No one has more trade agreements in the world than the European Union, with 76 countries currently. We are finalizing the ratification process on Mercosur. I hope that will be voted by the summer. Mexico equally is finalized and should be voting. And there are negotiations ongoing with Indonesia, with India, with Australia, Malaysia. I think the European Union should join the CPTPP, the Asia Pacific big agreement, with 13 countries being member and friends and allies of the European Union. That would probably be the place where future rules and standards are being set. And there will be mini agreements as well, sectorials. The European Commission concluded a mini agreement with South Africa the other day, and the agreement with India, if it's ever concluded, will be a very limited agreement, but that's probably the way trade looks in the future. Fourthly, it needs to continue pushing to reform and stabilize the WTO system. 166 countries are members there. A huge majority of them think it is worth trading with international rules and standards, and they've been good for the world, including the US. I know this is difficult, but we could try to see coalition of willing countries where we could move forward on green trade, on digital trade, and other matters. And fifthly, get our own house in order. We know that there is a lot of proposals on the table, emanating from the Draghi report, the Letta report, and so on, and the proposal on simplification. EU must really do those necessary reforms on the internal market, and also the reforms related to innovation and competitiveness with simplification. If this is not the moment, I don't know when it is, so that we can generate higher internal growth on the internal market, and also make full use of the green industry and make sure that the decarbonization is also economically profitable. So there are lots of things to do. These 5 areas require a lot of attention, and of course there are other things on the scope that is also important. Of course, continuing supporting Ukraine. There will be some hard years, no illusions. Trump doesn't like the EU. And this is what is going to be a characteristic of the relations the coming years as well. But there are a lot of ties that keep Europe and the US together. We should continue working with cities, with states, with universities, with, of course, the trade relations, with different NGOs, with different organizations. They are still there, and they are still very valued. And then we will see what happens. It's going to be difficult, but traditionally, and you will all know that as students of European politics, that crisis and external pressure actually usually works as an internal mechanism to reinforce and deepen European integration. And I think this will happen this time as well. So I stop there. There are lots of things to talk about, but I'm really, really eager to hear the other panelists and, of course, discussing with you in the audience. Thank you so much.
Thanks a million, Cecilia. That was really informative. And I just wanted to ask you, for the day that's in it, given that you were a trade commissioner, there was a lot of chatter amongst the journalists mainly, but also some analysts saying that the European Commission rowing back today, putting its own steel and aluminium retaliatory tariffs on pause, is almost a step down and sort of rolling over on the belly, given that the US still has steel and aluminium tariffs on the EU. I wonder, what's your first reactions to the Commission strategy here? Do you think it's a good one? And if not, what are the options? What is the kind of smart thing to do in the face of a negotiator, the deal maker like Trump?
Well, to be perfectly honest, and this is my personal view, I think it was stupid of the EU to withdraw those tariffs, because they were only aiming at the steel and aluminium tariffs, and they are still there. The car tariffs and the car part tariffs, which affects Europe a lot, are also still there. And then the 10% are also still there. And all these tariffs are, according to international law and WTO rules, illegal. They are not legitimate. So I think the European Union, from a position of strength, should have kept those tariffs, saying that these are still there. We are ready to talk about the other things, but this is also what we have in our toolbox if nothing happens. So I think that, and knowing a little bit the Trump administration, they don't respect weakness. And this could be seen, I think the European Union wanted to see it as a generous gesture that, okay, good, we are willing to talk. But I think it could be considered as a sign of weakness. So I wouldn't have done that. But again, you have 27 countries to manage here, and there were probably huge pressure from some countries to do this.
There certainly was. I think they had a meeting this morning of EU ambassadors.
Not least Ireland.
Not least Ireland. And it's only then actually that the Commission decided to nix those tariffs. So it's interesting that it seems there was a bit of pressure from member states. I'm going to throw open the panelists. If either Elaine or Massimo or Joost has any questions for Cecilia. If not, I have loads myself. Well, let me go ahead then with another one, Cecilia. I'm really keen to understand what you think the deal-making space is now. So the Commission says it's paused because they want to do a deal, right? And when we spoke a few weeks ago, you and I was asking you about your experience during the first Trump administration. I remember you telling me, there were all sorts of things on the table that you and then your successor, Phil Hogan, put there. There was a mini deal on porcelain. There was a deal on gas and soybeans. But this time it's different, you told me. Von der Leyen's talking about a 0-for-0 deal on cars and industrial goods. What's your sense of how that will go down across the sea, across the ocean? Is soybeans and gas going to cut it?
it's hard to say. I mean, a 0-for-0 deal on industrial goods is actually quite easy to do because we don't have a lot of tariffs there. There's always this focus on car tariffs where the European Union has 10% and the US 2.5%. Yes, but on trucks, the US has 25% and we have 6%, I think. But overall, on average, they are around 4%, slightly higher in European Union, but very low. So that could be agreed. But I don't think this would be enough. I think you would have to spice it up with more gas buying. But of course, it's not the Commission cannot decide to buy, for millions and millions of gas. These are companies in individual countries who do that. Weapons probably could be in there as well. But Trump administration have criticized the VAT. Well, that's a national thing. We cannot change that. They have criticized the tech rules, the Digital Market Act, and so on. But that can also not be renegotiated to make Mr. Musk happy. And then yesterday I heard they complaining about that Europe didn't want to import hormone beef. And that was one of the things we discussed a lot in TTIP. So there's so many other things on the agenda that goes, far beyond concrete tariffs. We could have an agenda on China as well, because we share some of the analysis when it comes to overcapacity, subsidies, dual use, and so on. And that could be part of an agenda as well. But so far, there has been no appetite for this. So it's really hard to know. I mean, if you negotiate, you give and take. But what is US willing to give the European Union? That is the question. So it's not going to be easy. But sooner or later, they will have to sit down.
I have a question in the chat from Colm Joyce, and actually it's an interesting one, and it's one that I'm going to ask all the panelists later. Will the EU go after the deficit on services? And it's that, you mentioned it, Cecilia, in your chat there, that the big bazooka, the anti-coercion instrument. I think there are other ways the EU can go after services, also the enforcement regulation, if I'm not mistaken. But what do you think is the appetite there? You said it's good to keep it in your pocket. Should the EU really go nuclear at this stage?
At this stage, not. But if nothing happens or if it deteriorates, it is an interesting weapon. And it has a very wide scope of ingredients you can pick from, mainly addressing services and digital trade, of course. And that would hurt the other administration, but you have to do it in a way that it doesn't hurt European citizens as well. I mean, you could do it on banks and on financial institutes, assurance companies, and so on. But if you address cloud and so on, I mean, we don't have many alternatives in the European Union as well. So the risk for European citizens to suffer from that is quite big. The discussions are there. I think some countries are very eager to use it quite quickly. Other countries are much more reluctant. It's wise to have it there to sort of announce what it could contain, so that it's on the table. But I think it would be it's a good strategy to wait, because it is a bazooka, and if you do that, it will be very hard to roll back. And it would be very ironic if this instrument that was originally designed to deter China was for the first time used against the United States.
I actually wanted to talk about China because you mentioned it as well. There may be an opening there to do a deal, because we have similar views to the US about how to sort of deal with overcapacity and things like that. But I'm also wondering what you think about this idea that's been bubbling that the US starting this trade war and the way it's treating China could actually push the EU closer. For example, like von der Leyen has been speaking to the Chinese premier this week. It's obviously a very complicated relationship, but it's not as simple as saying, well, you don't have the US anymore, you go to China. But what's the opening, if there is one, do you think, for a reset of any kind between the EU and China, now that the US has sort of taken a bazooka, to use a word, to the rest of the global trading order?
Well, it is very complicated because, of course, I think in the current situation, there are 23 or 24 ongoing anti-dumping investigations against China. So I mean, we consider that much of the trade is unfair from China's side. And there is a fear that China will dump products in Europe when they can't sell them in the EU. So that, on the one hand, there's that. And also what lays all over this is Ukraine, and China is supporting Russia and making it possible for the war to continue. Now there are rumors that there are even Chinese soldiers fighting on the Russian side. So this is making it very complicated, because that's beyond tariffs. Tariffs is, we can solve it, but this is really existential, Ukraine. On the other hand, yes, we do need China to trade with. Most of the trade is rather uncomplicated. China has a lot of very interesting green technology that European consumers and European companies want to trade with. We have this sleeping investment agreement that went into the freezer in the beginning of 2020. It was a really good agreement. I mean, on paper, it's excellent. China really concedes a lot of discipline on itself in there. But of course, that was postponed because of sanctions against 20 European individuals, journalists, researchers, and some members of the European Parliament. So that also will have to be solved. But you're right, there are several countries in the European Union now. I think Spanish Prime Minister Sanchez is there today, and they are pushing for, let's see what more can we get from China. So complicated, but yes, there's probably some room of maneuver. But it would be interesting to hear that, the other panelists' views on this as well, because it's really a moving target.
Yeah, I think I'm told that both Joost and Niall have raised their hands. Sorry, I can't see it, lads. I told you I was really bad with technology. Niall, do you want to go first, seeing as you're the host?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Cecilia, for that fascinating keynote. Just on CPTPP, I wanted to ask, do you give much credence to the idea that the EU would be reluctant to join it? The idea of it being a rule taker in joining it, and it might be better off doing bilateral deals with the members, or might it have seen the UK's experience positively, and that might open the door a little bit towards joining? What would be your thoughts on that?
Well, personally, I think the European Union should join the CPTPP, and I've advocated that for quite some time. And you're absolutely right that in the past, the Commission said, well, we already have bilateral trade agreements with most of these countries, and they go further than the CPTPP when it comes to market access and liberation, which is true. And the EU doesn't like to come knocking on the door from a position of, can we negotiate, please, with you? But geopolitics have changed so much, and all our friends and allies, or basically they are in this agreement, and they want to keep up rule-based trade, and they're all affected by what's happening in the world and in the White House right now. So even if the EU should maybe not join, formally apply right now, because it will take a lot of negotiations, I'm sure there could be some sort of umbrella negotiation, making the EU a kind of wannabe or adjacent member, to at least on a short-term basis. And what I hear from Brussels, there are changes in that direction, and there have been several ministers coming out lately from the member states saying that this should actually be something to look at. I think in Luxembourg yesterday, when the foreign ministers met, or was it trade minister? Sorry, there have been so many meetings. There were several ministers making the point in different press conferences. So let's hope.
Yes, thanks, Cecilia. And Joost, I think you had your hand raised.
Thank you, Ms. Malmström, for these comments. Just like Niall, I was struck by you advocating the EU joining CPTPP, and the second point that struck me is you saying you would not have suspended the retaliation. So if the EU is to start these negotiations from a position of strength and kind of multilateral cooperation, if you were commissioner, would you go purely bilateral with the US, or would you try and broaden out the negotiations in a more collective way? I've seen calls by ASEAN members for them to jointly go and talk to the US. New Zealand has actually called upon CPTPP to do some of this. In the chat, we saw someone saying perhaps EU, UK should join up. Isn't this a moment to kind of go beyond the bilateral talks and start a new big round of, we can call it Mar-a-Lago or the Trump round, but isn't that the moment now to take advantage of this?
I agree with you. And the beauty of not being a politician anymore is that you can say whatever you want. Nobody will hold you accountable. And yes, I think it was a mistake letting go of these initial counter tariffs yesterday, because they would have made EU stronger in a negotiation. And you're absolutely right. Ideally, this could be a moment to gather with your friends and allies to create, as we do in defense right now, a sort of coalition of the willing, and to make joint approachment and to see what to do. For instance, the EU has joined Canada in taking the steel and aluminium to WTO. It's a symbolic step, but still it's important. And I know that there are a lot of discussions with Canada, with Norway, UK, with Japan, Australia, New Zealand, etc. right now. But will that boil down to some sort of joint, well, realistically, I think the EU will try to go first on its own. But it could, in parallel, be a moment to try to revitalize at least parts of the WTO. And maybe why not launch a new round among the coalition of the willing? I'm hesitant to call it Mar-a-Lago round, but maybe that will make the case if we call it that. So realistically, I think the initial negotiations will probably be bilateral in the sense between the EU and others, and US and the others as well. But I saw the calls for more coordination in ASEAN and some CPTP members as well.
I'm sure we can find a name for it by the end of this event. Well, keep thinking. Elaine, you had your hand up there for a question.
Sure. Thank you so much to Ms. Malmström also for a fantastic talk. Beyond the CPTPP point, which is very interesting to me, being based in the UK, that was one of the first things we heard in Brexit. That was a real liberation moment for the British to be able to embark on the other side of the world in these ventures, which itself is a curious point. I think you mentioned about mini agreements, and I'm just wondering about the character of the DNA of the EU turning to this very much softer international economic law, digital partnerships era, very discrete mini agreements, and how this is compatible. Or I'll speak about it in a moment, but I'm just very curious to hear your views as someone who was within the EU institutions and saw the importance of consulting with the Parliament and stakeholders, how an era of much softer agreements and the EU's lack of success in actually implementing agreements, perhaps not being able to take them over the line for a whole variety of legal issues. To mix you, how do you see that kind of a future within the very strict structures of EU external relations law? They're not very forgiving for those wanting flexibility, agility, fast reactions.
Well, I think the EU will try as much as possible to stick to WTO rules, because it is a keen defender of the multilateral system and has been pushing with others to reform and to defend the WTO. But the reality is, as you say, I mean, that it is really hard. Those traditional free trade agreements, they take 5 years to negotiate, and then they take 2 years to translate, to legally scrub, and to get through the Parliament and all the member states and so on. And by then, the world is a different place. So what I think realistically is that the EU will rather look at smaller trade agreements. Will they be within the WTO strict legal framework? Probably not. But this is maybe a way to move forward with digital partnerships individual that has been done now with Japan, South Korea and Singapore, with this small sustainability agreement with South Africa. With India, we cannot count on a fully ambitious free trade agreement like the one we have with Canada or Japan. It will be much more limited, but maybe that's the way to do it. Still you have to follow the procedures of the member states and the European Parliament being involved. But maybe that is the way, at least for now, to do anything at all. And that's why it would make sense to be in the CPTPP as well, because there will be a lot of rulemaking done there, and there the EU could sit around the table. But it would be interesting to hear your legal views on this as well.
I think I'll take one more question before we move on to the panelists. I think I see one in the chat here from Tony Cox. Cecilia, I know that you weren't commissioner when Brexit was, well, a little bit when Brexit was happening, and not quite at the very end. The question he has is, how does the EU view the UK in this context? Because we were talking about the 10 versus 20% tariffs before they were paused. What are the chances of a unified approach in responding to the US, he asks.
It's a good question that I can't really answer. I haven't heard those discussions. I was very much there during the Brexit negotiation, even if it wasn't done by DG Trade so much. I can only note that in a parallel universe where we discuss defense cooperation, there has been a very important rapprochement between the EU and the UK, and I think the leadership shown by President Macron and Prime Minister Starmer has been very important in this talk, and that will spill over into other areas as well, I think. I think the UK was happy that they had only 10 and we had 20, but now we're down to the same baseline. So maybe that facilitates coordination as well. But I have to confess that I don't have any insights here. So I don't know.
Cecilia Malmström, thank you so much. Please, if you can, stay with us for the rest of the event.
Of course, yes.
I am going to now introduce our esteemed panel. First up, we have Professor Massimo Fabio. He's Professor of Trade and Customs Law at the Università Europea di Roma, and he's a partner and head of Trade and Customs Practice at KPMG in Italy. And he is going to give us a speech on, we're going to talk about how can businesses prepare and maybe go into what it means for countries with large trade surpluses and deficits with the US. Professor Fabio, take it away.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Let me share few slides in order to check what is happening now for business, which are very concerned because what is now happening is that that all the goods which have been produced in EU will be potentially levied in US. We have seen, as Ms. Cecilia Malmström already said, a rally, tariff on, tariff off. So it's something which has been, let's say, groundbreaking in the last weeks, because all the business noticed and checked what it will be having tariff, which can be can increase the cost of the product. So the big market, as US is, could be penalized for that. I have received a lot of claim from my clients, from multinationals, which are concerned about what you are seeing on the screen. A lot of huge tariff that would generate, let's say, the shift from foreign products in the US market, which are coming and originating in EU, to what is produced internally. And I would say that what we are now facing is a step back, because Mr. Trump just yesterday said, no, we are not levying these duties for the next 90 days. Now, what we should do, what EU should do, I would say that it is wise what Mrs. Ursula von der Leyen said yesterday. We will wait and see to check whether after these 90 days something will change in the approach of the US administration. But finally, what is the way to overtake these duties? Well, there are main solutions that actually could be used even earlier than these duties would be applied, because there are ways, solutions between the different parties that can be applied in the supply chain in order to lower the price. One of the most requested approaches, how I can change the origin of my goods. I'm actually producing something in China. This is imported in EU. I make something on this and then I export to US. Can I change what I'm now using, made in China, on made in EU member country, in order to take the lower duty applied for a made in France or made in Italy product? Well, this is actually possible, and there are tools according to which the company can reallocate the process, disaggregating the steps of the entire process of production and putting something in the EU territory in order to apply in the EU territory the last substantial processing. I have a case of a company who is producing engines, entire engines in China. Well, they are now importing the Raft engine in EU in order to execute some further processing in EU, changing the digit which will qualify the end product. And so the end product, according to the origin rules, will be entitled to be qualified as made in France or made in Italy and taking a lower duties in the US market. In using the taxable basis at the US destination, there is also the opportunity to use the first sale for export, which is the way to apply for a lower taxable basis. In case we have a producer who invoices a middleman for 100 and the middleman invoice the US company for 1,000, well, there is a rule in US legislation which can accept you file the 100 rather than the 1,000. So in this case, you can reduce the taxable basis, whatever is the duty that will be levied there. And I want to underline that this is now very interesting in order to overtake the higher duties which Mr. Trump is going to apply. But these solutions were in any case valuable for any business who wanted to decrease the customs impact to the US market. There is also another interesting solution that could be used, which means using bonded warehouse in EU in order to lower the taxable basis to import the goods in EU when you need to deliver and then to reprocess it and then export to US. These are special regimes which are given by the EU Customs Code, which allows to import some semi-finished product or raw materials and keep suspended the duties. So without being levied about anything concerning duties or VAT in any of the EU member states, then you can export to US the end product, and this end product is safe for any duty which was supposed to pay in EU, and so you have again a lower taxable basis to overtake the higher duty tariff in US. So what is needed now is to have a strategic classification planning, also to identify exactly which are the nature of the product. I have seen in the automotive sector that most of the business used to apply classification codes, which are the tariff to which the duty rate are applied, without a detailed analysis. They were using some general classification codes, which usually takes a higher duty rate. Well, by executing a strategic tariff classification, you can check what is the real code to be applied and save money. So in a nutshell, what we should do, what business should do, is to check what is the scenario, verify the three pillars of the customs assessment, which are classification, valuation, and origin, calibrate them in order to find the way to differently qualify the products by using the rules of origin, find the way to use a taxable basis which is the lower as it is given by the rules provided by both EU legislation and US legislation, and finally use any suspensive regimes. In US, it is applicable the foreign trade zone, which allows business to avoid any duty rate as long as you store your goods in the trade zone. Then you can execute some processing and then extract the goods by taking some advantage. I remember that just a few days ago, the Vice President Vance said, if you will generate some jobs in US, we will award you. Meaning that if any company will decide to apply to, let's say, start up a new co in US, they would be awarded for that. Well, I must say that some companies in automotive, in fashion, in cosmetic sector, in alcoholic sector told me, shall we check if it is valuable to apply this invitation and so start up a new plant in US? Well, this is an opportunity, but as we were saying, as Mrs. Cecilia Malmström was saying, tariff on, tariff off. If we decide to relocate the production plant in Ohio or in Minnesota, what it will be if this approach of the US administration will change in the next 2, 3, 6 months. So it's something that must be considered. Probably it's the ultimate solution to start up a business in US in order to avoid the duties and to realize the product directly in that market. I would suggest to think about what you see on the screen. So the solutions that can mitigate without the need of changing the supply chain, all the different tariffs that now or for the future, the US administration will apply. Thank you very much, Sarah. I think it's on from my side.
Perfect timing. Thank you, Massimo. I'll just take maybe one, possibly two questions here so we can get to the next panelist. And one I saw in the chat, I don't know, Massimo, if it's one for you, but it's a really interesting question from Evelyn Mulroe. She was talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, if I can find the question. Oh, no, sorry, it's from Colm Joyce, apologies. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. So the US is trying to impose diversity, equity, and inclusion policies extraterritorially in EU companies and its subsidies in the EU, I presume. Is that allowed? Does the panel have any opinions on that kind of extraterritoriality? Is that possible?
I don't think so. If this is for me, I don't think so. It's not possible, but it's not even possible to apply the duties that Mr. Trump is going to apply, because he is not in the ritual way of applying anti-dumping or countervailing duties. He's just using some tariff without any criteria in order to generate a tool to negotiate and obtain something else. We saw it what happened with Mexico and Canada. He provided, he menaced to apply tariff, but he wanted back some guards to attend the border from Mexico to US and from Canada to US in order to avoid the drug smuggling. So what he's asking now seems not in line with the law, with the international law, and I don't think he can pretend something that he cannot ask for.
Maybe a quick second question from my side, actually, on the displacement of goods from China to other markets. Is there any way, any scenario in which that could be a good thing? Like if there's a glut of cheap Chinese shoes and clothes that come into the EU, is that not good for European consumers who can get things for less?
Well, let me say another way. When we had the Trump one, a cosmetic company who was producing lipsticks or whatever is for the makeup for women was producing in Italy and then packaging in China. So they just moved the bulk to China, package it and export to all over the world. They were using content made in Italy, made in China. When Trump applied its tariff of 25% on cosmetic, it was a help for that business. So what we did, we used the rules of origin to show that even if the goods, the bulk, was sent to China, in China it was just packaged. That packaging did not influence the origin. So the goods, the finished products, which were exported back from China to wherever in the world, were entitled to be qualified as made in Italy. The EU authority released a binding origin information saying that that was correct because no substantial processing came in China. So it's a way to claim the origin, and in that way they were able to use those products in US qualified as made in Italy, even if the provenience was from China. Nothing changed in the turnover of the company. They got a valuable origin statement with the support of the EU authority. I guess that this is the way to move forward, and the authority, I mean, the member state should support the business in order to fight this trade war.
Thanks so much, Massimo. I want to move to our next panelist now, to Joost Pauwelen. Joost is Professor of International Law and co-director of the Centre for Trade and Economic Integration at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. And I think Joost is also going to tell us a bit about how businesses can respond and maybe talk to us about the multilateral institutions, the new multilateral order like the WTO. What's the point anymore?
Thank you. So I've been asked to say a few words on business preparation as well, EU response and multilateral cooperation. Because I'm a professor, but since a couple of months I'm also a lawyer back in Brussels, so dealing with all of these issues from a more company perspective. I mean, what Professor Fabio was saying is exactly also what I'm experiencing in my law practice. So lots of companies panicking, requesting us for help. Also trade associations for the first time being faced with these major trade concerns. At the same time, I think many other companies, many other businesses are just taking a wait and see approach. It reminds me a bit of Brexit, when lots of people just said, well, we'll see when it comes and then deal with it, which of course I wouldn't recommend. What we've seen is individual companies reaching out, but also lots of trade associations. In Brussels, you have a trade association for just about everything. And what they've been doing, I would say, is three things. One is try and lobby, if possible, with the US authorities to get your product off the tariff list. And there's some scope for this, and I think more scope will come because President Trump was saying that this may be a new opening in the near future. The other thing that companies have tried to do is to put their product on the EU retaliation list, or on the country take it off, depending on what they want to achieve. So a lot of activity there. More immediate concerns, and that's really what Professor Fabio already mentioned, is, these things come on and off. You have things like on-the-water exceptions, where if you can get your product on the boat, even in Europe, before midnight, when a new tariff kicks in, you'll be okay when the boat arrives at customs in the US. Lots of questions, concerns on rule of origin. We've been talking about many countries, but Canada and Mexico, they have the USMCA with the US. They were hit first with additional tariffs, but then if you actually ship goods in line with the rules of origin of the USMCA, you don't have to pay. So a lot of questions, highly technical customs questions will come up. So very busy times for law firms. And then the last thing they're doing is the more longer term planning. Because one thing we haven't mentioned yet, I think, and it's really important, a lot of the concerns that US companies are facing, competition from China, unfair trade, I think the EU industries are facing the same. And of course, we may be talking about, okay, let's do more FTAs as Europe, let's try and get rid of these tariffs. But if you want to be honest, the EU has problems that are very similar to the US. We have zero duties on many imports. We face unfair competition from many countries, and we'll have to deal with this. We have high energy prices, we have a costly Green Deal, and we have massive competition from China. So we are or will be in the same boat soon. The other longer term issue is one that you've already mentioned, trade diversion. I think a lot of industries are aware of this. Even if product may not be directly hit in the US, if Chinese imports are kept out, or Canadian or Mexican or Indian, these products have to go somewhere. And what is the best paying market these days? It's the EU market, perhaps the UK as well. So I think we'll see a lot of activity there. So strongly advising companies to keep track of your import data, the changes you might see, and then, if need be, quickly ask for protection from the European Commission. There's all these jumping the tariff strategies that have been mentioned. Of course, it becomes difficult if everyone is hit, and if the rules change so quickly and so frequently, to just move plans from one place to the other. Just one example I would mention, in the wake of the EU retaliation against the first US steel tariffs, Harley-Davidson, which was hit badly by these EU retaliations, they thought to be clever and moved production from the US to Thailand. But actually the European Court of Justice a couple of months later found that that wasn't enough for your motorcycle to be classified as made in Thailand if it was just to jump or to avoid the EU retaliation. So we'll have to be really careful recommending these strategies, knowing that some of them may work, others may not, and others may be obsolete before implemented. Second point, and we've spoken a lot about the EU response already, I would rather support what the EU is doing. I think they've played it well, balancing firmness with flexibility, and the pause to me makes sense. At the same time, they are continuing to produce new lists to retaliate for other tariffs beyond the steel tariffs. What is also really interesting is that the EU has not filed a WTO complaint yet against the US, not on steel, not on the reciprocal tariffs, not on the car tariffs. What is also really interesting to me is that the US has targeted the EU as a whole. They haven't targeted Ireland, UK, Germany separately. So I think that has helped in terms of bolstering the EU response. Again, yes, the EU is responding by pushing for more free trade agreements, which I understand. Again, one thing we shouldn't forget is that the EU also has major competitiveness concerns. So on the one hand, they will liberalize or try to liberalize with countries. On the other hand, there's a clear trend from the new Commission to be more protective, to use trade defense instruments more often, even safeguards, to have bi-European rules, resilience criteria. So action plans for steel, for the chemical industry. So we have to, again, be very honest that the EU is facing a lot of the problems that the US is facing as well. And we'll have to deal with it. Overcapacity in China, we have zero duties on so many products, and it becomes very, very difficult to manage in this new world. Finally, on multilateral cooperation, and I think I've played my cards already with my question. I'm really seeing some silver lining in what the Trump administration is doing. And I'm based in Geneva. I've been based here for many, many years. I've heard talk of WTO reform for decades. It's not going to happen. It's a stalemate. We are saying the same things we said 20 years ago. Something needs to change, and rocking the boat at some level may be exactly what we need. I know I may be looking at this in a way that is too optimistic, but if you think of it, the proposal for a US reciprocal tariff, and then the pause of yesterday, and now 75 countries flying to Washington to negotiate. If you put all of these elements together, this is what we normally would call a round of trade negotiations. That's why I think we should find ways to collectivize. I want to avoid the word multilateralize, because that will upset the Americans, but to really find ways for these negotiations not to be purely bilateral, for ASEAN to jump in, CPTPP to come there as a unity, for the EU to find a coalition of the willing, and to have talks beyond purely bilateral talks, because that's exactly what the world needs. Trump is right that the trade balance, as it was struck 30 years ago, doesn't make any sense anymore today. So we have to do something, and to do it in the WTO is complicated, is difficult, although I think you have procedures there to do exactly this. But imagine if these negotiations would lead to, yes, some tariff hikes. In other places, we would see tariff reductions. But when the dust settles on this, we may have a new club, a new kind of WTO, be it out of CPTPP, be it reformed out of Geneva, some more tariff reductions, other tariff hikes by the US, but I think also by the EU, we'll need it. And in the end of the day, we may have something like what happened in the early 90s when the US rocked the boat by creating NAFTA. That was the trigger for the creation of WTO. Again, I may be looking at it in too rational a way, too optimistic, but I think there's scope here to use this crisis to have reform of global trade relations in a positive way. I'll stop here.
Thanks so much, Joost. That was Really interesting. And it's nice to be optimistic sometimes, isn't it? We've had a week of just pure mania. So this is, I'm here for it. I actually noticed a question in the chat just as you were speaking that's, I think, quite relevant. It's from Beren Shoka, who says that the US administration doesn't care about what's legal. Is Europe prepared to do a deal with the US, with a US president that routinely operates outside the rule of law? And how can it? How can it do that if he's not, the measures he takes are not legal?
I think Ms. Malmström already mentioned it. I've been really impressed by how the EU, in their response and whatever they do, they really want to play by the rule book. They want to follow WTO rules. And again, some of them are outdated, but the basic principles, the basic mechanisms still make a lot of sense. So yes, there's options for the EU to sit down with the US and negotiate in line with WTO rules. It could take the form of a free trade agreement, of course, being phased in over decades, possibly. They could also give concessions, the EU could, and then provide them to other countries on an MFN basis, albeit concessions conditioned on certain things happening. People forget that MFN can be conditioned. The GATT allows you to condition a tariff concession based on, I don't know, I'm just thinking of something, reducing a trade deficit or getting rid of overcapacity, right? So it is possible to strike deals. I mean, the WTO, the GATT, it's a negotiating machine, and it's not rigid or as rigid as you might think. So I think there's a lot of scope to do things that would at least pass the WTO laugh test. And yes, the EU will stretch the rules a bit, but I think it will be very important to stick to the rules while engaging with the US.
Thanks a million. I'm going to move on quickly, but I think we'll come back and have questions at the end with all the panelists. So to our next panelist now, I'm going to call Professor Elaine Fahy. She's Professor of Law and Jean Monnet Chair in Law and Transatlantic Relations at City Law School in London. Elaine, I think you're going to talk to us a bit about soft law, soft power, and the EU-US Trade and Technology Council. Take the floor, please.
Thanks so much, Sarah. So I'm going to continue in the same vein as being an optimistic pessimist, and to put things in slightly broader perspective, that EU-US relations have long been criticised by many political scientists all over the world, and also lawyers in particular, for being the most law-light, institution-light structures that one can possibly imagine. And I think one of the things that's quite lost in the era of Trump is just recognizing how during the Biden administration, the closest that the EU and US possibly have ever been in terms of administration that was so willing to hear about Europe has really been spearheading this direction of soft international economic law and a very different vision as to the place of trade. And I suppose as somebody who works in external relations and international relations law in that sense, to see the EU being much more weaker in external action than I think is possibly recognised to a degree, given that the EU in its DNA is founded upon the rule of law in Article 218 of the treaty, the EU treaties in Article 21. The EU is very much has a set of principles that relates to the rule of law. So to see the EU engaging in many mini deals and digital partnerships, including with its leading trade partners, is perhaps a very difficult thing to view. And I also briefly want to mention the place of the EU and US in international organizations in recent times. But I suppose what's happened, in the last number of years has been this Trade and Technology Council between the EU and US that took place to unite them over China and to see what degrees of cooperation and convergence was possible. And it's a remarkably unsuccessful forum that the EU engaged a huge amount of energy. Many civil servants spent lots of time going back and forth, and it was a remarkable experiment in trying to come up with global goal making in the absence of achieving much in the way of a legal solution. And I suppose what's also very damaging for the EU is that it has not just ventured upon this with the US, but also with India. And some people would say that the tricky partners with very strong preferences as to data, India, and localization, the US being much more complex. But to see the EU shift towards many digital partnerships, the so-called Singapore experiment, has been a very difficult thing to watch for some quarters of the European Parliament, but perhaps, from stakeholders' point of view as well, how to impact civil society, how to influence trade. So you might look at the news and be baffled as to the speed and agility of trade negotiations and or tariff wars rather. But in fact, it's a very open and very transparent forum. And we might say that a lot of what has happened in the last number of years in a much calmer, more peaceful setting, structured setting, for example, of the EU-US Trade and Technology Council, has been entirely outside the boundaries of media scrutiny, for example, or lots of academic commentary. I suppose what's also very difficult to see is as to where this goes. The only legal agreement, if you like, between the US and the Biden era might be said to be a critical minerals agreement, a negotiation that was started up, which contrasts perhaps much more positively to the so-called lobster agreement of the first Trump administration. But we come back to this basic point on what are the most significant things in current times. That's trade and technology and trade and data flows. And the EU and US in the last number of years, did very important work on mapping joint visions of AI, how to negotiate AI concepts across, the OECD, G20, and they did lots of important work about, learning from each other, the NIST in the US with the EU's AI board. And, these are not legally very interesting outcomes for many people, but that was quite an important, exercise just to watch, but very much a law-free idea. And much more importantly, the EU and the US agreed a data privacy framework agreement, including a transatlantic court in the early months of 2022. And that was one of the first actions of the US administration to upend the independent bodies on that entity. So we have, one of the largest data flow regimes in the entire world is very much imperiled now by this. Now, we don't have a court with the UK, we don't have a court with Japan or a court with Korea or Canada for their data flows. And a lot of legal scholars will play about with these terms, but just to say that these are extremely difficult EU law questions as to how the EU's very high standards in GDPR terms meet with its partners across the world. And to see that demise with the Trump administration, I think presents a very difficult path going forward. I suppose the UK has also been taking a view that the EU's AI standards are binding standards are a difficult starting point. And of course, the US Vice President took aim at much of the EU's rules on content moderation, so on the DSA and the DMA, very publicly. So I suppose that brings us to the broader question of there's a UN development and a global privacy compact that's not binding. There's a Council of Europe framework on AI that is binding that the US signed up to. That now it looks like pursuing a very different path. And there's been some interesting developments in WTO e-commerce. But what is the future of the world if we have this commitment to delegalize? If we've this commitment to soft law, to divergence, it makes it a very difficult time for consumers, for ordinary citizens as the subjects and objects of, for example, the Internet of Things widen. It's impossible for any consumer all over the world to buy a child's toy without signing up to an app, for example, smartwatches and so on. As every second person is wearing things that fuse goods and services. We live in a world where we need law and rules and standards, and consumers need to know, how to go forward in all of this. So I think, just to conclude, one of the, interesting points about the EU having, a very weakened external relations agenda, but its internal market is super powerful, and it has so many external effects are very powerful and very important, but it's become so protectionist as to, for example, digital strategic autonomy. Everything from green tech to cloud computing is all very much couched in this framework of protectionism. And so we're left with quite a difficult legal situation, that it's not so easy to respond more broadly, more strategically, if it's not using the full apparatus of EU law, where a lot of its internal market laws are motivated by, and it's a very thin legal base, and its external relations powers are not getting used to their full flex, as it were, because of their challenges in taking them forward. So the era of the optimistic pessimist or the pessimistic optimist, I think one can say either one, but I'll sit on the first camp and I'm very happy to discuss further.
Thanks a million, Elaine. That was really interesting. Actually, just out of curiosity, because I was just thinking about it when you were talking there, what do you make of the EU's sort of push to deregulate? Now, they're not talking about tech regulations yet, although there was a hint this week. They have this new AI strategy where they haven't ruled out looking again at the AI Act, which is only just in place. Do you think that in some way could, I don't know, bring the US more on board, that there's a willingness there to kind of take some of the pain out of the rules that they put in place over the last, especially 8 years?
Absolutely, that's a really important question as to how much the EU's alphabet soup of its digital markets, actually Digital Services Act, the so-called, the Biden administration labeled this as anti-American, and the EU's digital diplomacy has started to take effect initially in Silicon Valley of all places. But question mark as to how much of this is open to revision. It's certainly not as much part of the initial packages put on the table of measures to be so-called watered down or pared back, but you can also look at something like the AI Act and say, well, there's actually a huge amount of very grey issues where it's not as hard law as one might think. So it's also just based on products. Fear of it is more overstated, and perhaps we might say that things like the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act there's lots of interesting litigation ongoing, and perhaps the enforcement of that could be tamed down. So it certainly is the case that that all of these questions are very much on the table, and whether the EU has been holistic enough as to its approach to the digital, I think, is a fair question and will be asked a lot further going forward.
Thanks a million, Elaine. I think we do have some time for questions after, but what I'll do is I'll bring in Niall now, our esteemed host. Thank you so much for organising this. Niall is Assistant Professor of Economic Law and Deputy Director of the Brexit Institute at DCU. Niall is going to talk us through a few issues about the level playing field, EU values, what's not WTO compatible, and what the EU's long-term interests are in this ongoing but on pause, we hope, trade war with the US. Niall.
Thanks very much, Sarah. My comments mostly build on those of the previous speakers, but have a slightly different emphasis in a couple of areas. So I'll mainly focus on potential EU responses to US tariffs and highlight a couple of points that I see as being fundamental. It is within the framework of my Jean Monnet module on leveling the playing field, but it comes in indirectly, I would say. So my first point is that WTO compatibility must be non-negotiable for the EU. The enduring interest is in defending the multilateral trading system, and the EU must stick to its long-held principles, ensuring its actions remain firmly within the bounds of WTO law in its current dealings with the US. The rulebook is sufficiently flexible to do this, as Professor Paulin highlighted. So there are two main elements to this as I see it. First, in concluding trade agreements and building alliances in response to tariffs, and second, in our dealings with the US itself. So I'm going to speak about both, but first I want to say that there should be no question of compromising on our respect for the international rule of law to try to get a favourable deal for certain industries. Further, in a situation where you're dealing with a partner as unpredictable as the Trump administration, it would be doubly defeating to go this route where no such deal may transpire, particularly given the range of grievances that have been expressed against the EU, ranging from VAT rates to hormone-treated beef, which we still don't want to let into the single market. So the EU has to be careful about not being seen to be willing to conclude deals that likely would not comply with WTO law. And upholding the rules-based order, it's not an act of self-sacrifice. This promotes stability, global economic growth, and the EU's reputation as a reliable partner. So what is the scope for a deal with the US? We proposed this 0 for 0 tariff arrangement, eliminating industrial tariffs with the US, which has been rejected. The WTO compatibility of such an arrangement would depend on its benefits being extended to all WTO members or being part of a formal free trade agreement, or else possibly something like a waiver from WTO membership, which would be unlikely. So I would like to see the full details of this arrangement, but there are definitely questions to be answered about its WTO compatibility, particularly as market access is at its core. So it's not about sustainability, mutual recognition, agreements, or things like this. Beyond this, the EU should remain open to WTO-compatible deals with the US where opportunities arise. So a good example that was mentioned was the pragmatic mini trade agreement in 2020, concluded by Trade Commissioner Phil Hogan and USTR Robert Lighthizer. So this covered a small amount of tariff lines on lobster. It aimed at de-escalating tensions, and the opportunity for this arose because there was issues in Maine where demand fell sharply for these products in response to Chinese tariffs. So importantly, the tariff reductions here were extended to all WTO members, so it was WTO consistent. We must avoid mini deals that clearly depart from the rules-based system. In my blog post that I published on the Delhi website today, I give the 2019 US-Japan mini deal as an example of such a deal. On trade agreements more generally, I agree with previous speakers that we must immediately prioritise forging deeper economic arrangements with willing partners. My starting point is slightly different. I suggest in my piece that we should focus on WTO members that have demonstrated commitment to the multilateral system. For example, the 26 other members of the MPIA, the alternative system of appeal at the WTO launched after the US paralysed the appellate body. This would also build on the leadership the EU has already shown here. While the EU has trade agreements with many of these countries, we can also make progress in building on existing agreements, ratifying Mercosur, concluding negotiations with members like Australia and the Philippines. And this can help mitigate against the disruptions of unilateralism, reinforce cooperation and support for the rules-based order. So how should we rock the boat and collectivise, as Joost suggests? I think a possible model for cooperation here is informal economic partnerships that we have seen emerging in recent years. We've heard about TTC, and IPEF is another example of such an arrangement, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. A format like this could be a useful model for cooperation and experimentation, in my view. It's a flexible partnership like this that can have opt-outs where states do not wish to participate, and it can be a focal point for dialogue and building coalitions. Progress can be built incrementally, and it doesn't have to be a binary outcome that we reach after a decade of negotiations, as Cecilia was cautioning against. And I agree that we need to shift, away from this practice in the era that we're in. So then in the EU response to US tariffs, we must ensure the WTO compatibility of dealings with the US. And this should involve challenging US measures at the WTO, as China and Canada have done over the past week. And Joost's point here was interesting that the EU has not done so yet. It may also involve countermeasures for which there should be a number of potentially WTO compatible defences. We can work within the rulebook in our responses. If the EU, feels that it has to respond immediately, a crucial concern that emerges with relying on GATT Article 21 or potentially a defence under GATT Article 20 is systemic risk. So the EU has to weigh its options carefully, because if it invokes security exceptions against US tariffs, we risk undermining the system that we're trying to preserve. The anti-coercion instrument offers another tool for defending interests. It could be used if the US is deemed to have engaged in economic coercion, for instance, by pressuring the EU into changing its trade policies, such as its tariffs on automobiles. Another key advantage to the ACI is its speed. So the point has been raised that the timelines refer to 4 months or 6 months for decision making, but these are upper limits on the amount of time that has to be taken. And in urgent cases, I think the EU could act much quicker. My second point is that the EU has to defend its long-term interests. It must take a long view and act to defend its competitiveness and industrial base. In 2025, we have seen the EU take steps to show how serious it is about this, which is encouraging. Progress on Mercosur, the competitiveness agenda, and a clear readiness to deal with geopolitical tensions with pragmatism. This all sends strong signals to those who think that Europe is asleep. I think the EU must defend its interests using both carrots and sticks. Certain US demands cannot be accommodated. We're not going to relax our standards on food. But when it comes to the trade deficit in goods, we should not hold back our promises here. As we've heard, we can address this in a relatively win-win way, purchasing more gas, defence equipment, possibly agricultural purchases. But the EU also faces clear risks that have to be navigated carefully. And Massimo mentioned this, but an example I chose is the pharmaceutical companies which are announcing new manufacturing sites in the US and considering moving overseas manufacturing to existing plants in the US. So there is obviously a significant incentive for companies to shift production to the US, given that there might be tariffs coming of 25% in this area. So where production is relocated out of the EU in direct response to WTO illegal tariffs from a third country, an EU response is required. Manufacturers make multi-decade investment plans, and the EU needs to find ways of neutralizing any incentive to shift production out of the EU created by Trump's tariffs. So to sum up, I believe the EU has to strengthen its partnerships with existing allies along the lines we've heard, so long as this is compatible with WTO rules. We must resist striking deals with the US that undermine the multilateral trading system. And as per the headline of my piece today, concluding such agreements where market access is at their core is a Faustian pact. It would ultimately be detrimental to the EU, in my opinion. Even if you believe that the WTO has lost its relevance to a significant extent, the rulebook is still the rulebook, and abandoning long-standing commitments comes at a cost. The EU has pledged to do what is necessary to save the current WTO system, and I guess we will see whether this rhetoric will withstand the challenging times ahead. I'll leave it there.
Thanks a million, Niall. I will open up the floor again to questions. If the panel has any, I counsel you to come in. You might have to wave at me because I somehow don't have access to seeing your hands raised. I don't know why. But I also have questions in the chat. And I had one, actually, this might be, maybe let's zoom out a tiny bit, no pun intended. There was a question from Evelyn Mulroe earlier on in the chat. Can the EU ride this out for 4 years? I mean, is there enough opposition in Congress to sort of push back against Trump's policies? And maybe to ask Cecilia Malmström this, because you were there during Trump 1, like, did things fundamentally change when the midterms happened? Was it easier as the EU to kind of come back, make a deal, get things done?
Well, I don't want to be the negative person here, but we should not overestimate the logic in this administration. They have absolutely no respect for any international law or any international organization. They despite it completely. And they're now putting huge pressure on the WTO not to do this, not to do that, withdrawing their money, etc., doing the same thing in the OECD, etc. So I fully agree that the EU should at all times be WTO compatible as much as possible when there are laws. But the US administration has absolutely no interest whatsoever in being WTO compatible. If that coincides, well, maybe, but so we should be very aware of that. Well, hoping for the best and just staying out for 4 years. Well, first of all, yes, there is an opposition in the Republican Party, but it's so far very weak. They are afraid of their positions and so on. It might accelerate a little bit as we are approaching midterm election, but we must also realize that there's no really strong opposition going on in this country. And we'll see what happens. The difference from last time was that we'll see if it changes the majorities in the House and in the Senate. But so far, that's why he's rushing through all this, I think, to be sure that he can do as much as possible, and he will do a lot of damage. The transatlantic relationship as we knew it, I think, is dead for a long time. There has been a lack of trust that has been killed in the Munich speech and with the action against Zelensky, that it will take a long time to repair. So it doesn't help if there's a successful midterm election, and who knows if Mr. Trump will run again or if J.D. Vance will run. So I don't think we can plan our actions and hope that after the midterm election everything will be rosy, because that's not going to happen. So we need to be to be firm, the panelists have said so many wise things. I agree with basically everything, and we should really try to do that with our allies, looking after our own house, and trying to stick as much as it's possibly feasible with the WTO. We cannot count on any response on the WTO compatibility from this administration.
Thanks a million. I have a question, I think, from Elettra Bargellini. Elettra, are you able to unmute yourself and ask?
Yes. Can you see me?
All good.
Can you hear me as well? Okay, thank you.
Yes.
So I have a question for Niall, and I was wondering what he was thought about in order to avoid relocation, whether the EU could consider to further relaxing state aid rules, building on the flexibility already introduced with the temporary frameworks, and specifically with the 2023 temporary crisis and transition framework that the EU introduced in order to avoid companies moving in the US following the introduction of the IRA.
Thanks very much, Elettra. Absolutely, that is part of the strategy. You know, brain drain or investment or startups going to the US. We need to be competitive, and relaxing state aid might be appropriate in certain instances. Within the speech, I was referring to that in the context of one of the sticks, though, and I was basically saying that, you know, this is a slightly unprecedented situation where you don't have manufacturing potentially leaving because of lower costs or, you know, a business model or something like that. It's an active, concerted campaign to get manufacturing to leave your country, and through punitive tariffs. And so I kind of left it as an open thought as to what the stick would be, but you know, the question of market access back to or at least calling into question whether or not all of the benefits that companies currently have would be there if they were to shift production out of certain products, the manufacturing in the EU. I think this has to be on the table. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a million. And I have another question in the chat here from Attracta Ivrin. How do you see the EU's carbon border adjustment policies being leveraged in response to US tariffs? I'm not sure who it's for, but whoever wants to have a go can have a go at that one.
Did I see there was a second part of that question about CETA in Ireland?
There is another part. Yes, it says,
I think Ms. Malmström mentioned CBAM. Yeah, so I saw the part on CETA in Ireland, which maybe I can pick up on. I think that there is an argument for having ICS applying only to those member states that wish to have it. You know, the capital exporting states, the Netherlands, most member states, in fact, but for member states where there is such strong opposition and court rulings, we have the option of amending the Arbitration Act in Ireland. But I mean, when you consider it in its totality, I think it might make sense to just let it apply in the 20 or so member states that wish to have this system.
Thanks a million. We've got 1 minute to go. I might just ask a question just because I'm writing a story on it. And I really, really want to know what Cecilia Malmström thinks of the likely, and we've all talked about the need to diversify trade, and the EU's going for that. And in theory, brilliant ideas. We all want as many trade deals as possible. But how likely is it, do you think, especially Mercosur, that bugbear, that albatross around the EU's neck for the last 25 years? Are we now at a crunch point? Are we at the moment when Mercosur will finally go through, do you think?
I actually do think so. I know that there's a lot of opposition in France, Austria, Netherlands, and parts of Belgium, Poland, but the geopolitical situation has calmed that, and it only needs a qualified majority. It doesn't need unanimity. So France will probably not vote against. At best, we cannot hope that they abstain. They can vote against. And we can still get it through. So yes, I think we actually will get it through finally. It's a very good deal, and the last additions that has been done in the sustainable chapter is unique. It's really something that we could look at. And CBAM wasn't easy under Biden either. they try to stop it. They try to block negotiations in the so-called Gaza agreement on sustainable steel and aluminium. So CBAM will be hard, and I think we cannot count on the US complying with it. If it enters into force, I think it will be delayed overall.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much to our panelists. I'm going to hand back to Niall now to kind of wrap up and maybe give us what you think were the sort of conclusions and best ideas to come out of this. Thanks to everybody.
And thanks so much to you, Sarah, for it was really wonderful. And the format of asking the question at the end of everyone's talk really worked well. So yeah, my main takeaways, I think there's a lot of food for thought on the nature of building alliances and the various thoughts we heard on rules of origin and how this will affect things going forward. So listen, I just want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank all the speakers for the time they've put into preparing. It has been a really enjoyable session. I also want to thank Professor Federico Fabrini and Charlie Halford, who managed this event and the registrations for it. This is our last Delhi event for this academic year. I would encourage everyone to stay tuned for our future events and continuing following us on trade, as it'll remain an important research cluster for us moving ahead. So thanks again, everyone, and I want to wish you a very good evening.